This is it. We're going to finish up Micah today, or look at Micah. Just a reminder, next week, next 2 weekends, Sundays, no Bible study on Sunday morning. Next weekend we got the children's Christmas program service at 11, so they'll be practicing. I'll be with them a little bit. And then the December 29th holiday weekend. So this is it. We're going to dive into Matthew and Micah. Finish Micah's. Take a little bit look at Matthew, because Matthew does have something to do with this. And we'll finish Micah, the book of Micah. And I don't know what we'll do in the new year. I'm debating. Throw this out. I'm thinking about doing something on Sunday mornings with the doing a deep dive into the Lord's Supper, into communion, and what it is, like a back to the basics, but a deep dive into it. Is that be interesting to you all, or?
No.
Okay.
Everything's interesting.
Well, thank you. I understand, but I also want to. I want to do something that intrigues you too, and captivates you a little bit. So that's what I'm thinking of right now. All right. So Micah, chapter 5. But before we do Micah chapter 5, let's do 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Then we'll eventually get to Micah chapter 5. But I want to start in 2 Samuel.
2 Samuel.
Yes. Chapter 5. And when we think about Micah's structure, this third frame here, kind of the third section of the book, he is, at the end of chapter 3, Micah described the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the rubbleness of the Zion, Mount Zion, right? Jerusalem was the city. His prophecy says 4 nations are going to come and destroy it to rubble. Chapter 4 begins to introduce, though, the restoration of Jerusalem and Mount Zion. Why is Jerusalem so important? Well, let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Ready there? No, chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Okay. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the only one who led Israel on the military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" Okay? So this is though after Saul has died, David has been anointed as king, even though there's already a King Saul. And so there was basically about a 7-year civil war between all the tribes. The tribe of Judah said, "Yeah, we want David." He's from the tribe of Judah. All the other tribes said, we kind of want to go with Saul's descendants. Okay? They had a 7-year civil war to solve it. And eventually, David conquers, and he wins that. And so they all come to him and say, "Yeah, you're the guy we want to shepherd God's people." Verse 3. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and all of Judah for 33 years. Okay? So where does his kingdom start? His kingship starts at the city of Hebron. Okay? But eventually, he's going to move into Jerusalem. And we're going to hear that in verse 6 now. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." So they thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion. And notice what the phrase this writer gives it to it. The city of David. Okay. So now this becomes known as the city of David. Jerusalem forever then will become known as the city of David. So it becomes the political place of life in Israel, but it also becomes, with David, the central place of worship as well. So it becomes the capital, the little star, but it also will contain then, he moves the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle to it, and eventually Solomon will build a temple there. So what's Jerusalem called? The city of David. Now, Will the New Testament affirm that?
No.
No, it does not.
Well, we're not.
What about the gospel?
What does the gospel say is the city of David?
It just says
It does never calls Jerusalem the city of David in the New Testament. They call a different place. Luke chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor, and everybody would go to their own place. And so Joseph went to Bethlehem, the city of David. The New Testament writers will never, ever affirm Jerusalem as being the city of David.
The town of David.
Nope.
Because the temple was
Bethlehem.
destroyed? But,
Yes.
yeah.
It gets judged, doesn't it? Jesus condemns it. Jesus says it's going to get ruined. Think of the two places. Jerusalem, who lives in Jerusalem? Who has Micah been criticizing the whole time in his being the prophet?
the rulers.
The rulers, the big people.
Right.
Yeah, the government leaders and the religious leaders, the big people. He keeps knocking them down, saying, you don't live as God's people. And he's critical of them. And where do they all live? Jerusalem. And that's the same in Jesus' day. Jerusalem. That's where the big people live. The people who live for themselves. Who lives in Bethlehem? The lowly people. Remember, our good friend Micah lives in a little village off here at the very edge of the Gaza Strip and the land of Judah. He lives in a little village there called Moresheth Gath. And he lives in this little village, a lot like Bethlehem, was a little backwater country village. And he's looking at everything that's happening in Jerusalem and says, God's not for the high people. God comes for the low people. And in fact, God's going to use the lowest of the people to do his work. So the New Testament writers never affirmed Jerusalem, but only Bethlehem. So now let's look at Micah chapter 5.
I noticed that right above it, Bethel, there's another like temple.
There is. In Bethel, this is the northern tribe. So, John, when Solomon, after Solomon dies, the son Jeroboam, or Rehoboam, he divides. The northern tribes divide from the southern tribes. Now, if you're a northern king named Jeroboam, and you've got people that you want allegiance to you, you're not going to let them go to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. So they build their own temple there in Bethel, and they build one up there in Dan as well. And the Old Testament writers, the Book of Kings, criticizes that entire realm of how it worked. But yeah, that's a good observation. All right, so now we're in Micah chapter 5. So Jerusalem is going to be restored, and if he's going to restore the city, he's also going to restore with a new ruler. So take a look at chapter 5, verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, what does the ESV have for that?
Clans of Judah.
Do they have small as well?
You are too little.
You are little, yeah. You are little, too little among the clans of Judah. Out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And then down to verse 4, and he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. And he's going to do it in the majesty of the name of the Lord God, and people will live securely, and everyone will reach, and his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. So out of not Jerusalem, but where? Bethlehem. And what's the chief describer of Bethlehem? How is it described?
Small.
Small, little, the littlest of clans. You're nobodies. But yet out of them is going to come this one who rules, who also came from Bethlehem.
Jesus.
Well, Jesus, yes, Jesus will be the fulfillment of this, but before Jesus, well, let's go back to 1 Samuel 16. We're going to do a lot of Bible gymnastics today. 1 Samuel 16. So now it's 1 Samuel, and it's chapter 16. So who was the first anointed king over Israel?
So,
Saul. Saul is the first anointed king. What was the one characteristic about Saul, if you remember? What stood out among him? He was from the tribe of Benjamin too, by the way. Benjamin's tribe would have lived just north of Jerusalem. So this is where Benjamin's tribe would have had their land from. Well, what was his chief characteristic that the writer mentions? He was a head taller than everybody else. So he was a large man. He was a big man. You want your king to be strong, right? Because he's going to lead you in battle. So they want the bravest and the strongest. Well, when they come to anoint him, by the way, you know what Saul was doing? He was hiding out in the luggage. He didn't want it. He didn't really want it. But because Samuel picks him, because he's the biggest guy, he gets anointed. But quickly, God rejects Saul because Saul imposes himself onto what the priests and the prophets were called to do, and Saul kind of takes over. And God says, no, you can't be my king anymore. You can't be the king over my people anymore. And so he's going to pick a new leader. And so Samuel is going to go and find a new leader. That's chapter 16. Are you there? The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be kings. All right? So he's going to Bethlehem. Again, not a big village, just a still small little village, the least of them. But Samuel said, how can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you. Say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? He said, yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me. And they consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to sacrifice. And then they began to bring in his sons. The first son comes, Eliab, and he said, oh, this is surely the one. But the Lord said, nope, not that one. Verse 7, right? Do not consider his appearance or his height. I rejected him. The Lord does not look at all the things that man looks at. Man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So they bring another son. Nope, not that guy. Verse 10. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Solomon, but Solomon said to him, the Lord has not chosen one. So he said to Jesse, are these all your sons? And he says, oh yeah, they're still the youngest, but he's doing what?
He's tending the sheep.
He's tending the sheep. That is what the youngest do. They're the sheep tenders. They're the shepherds. When I was up in Uganda, the northern parts where they were all nomadic people, and they were goat herders, cow herders, and they didn't have sheep, but they had camels, right? And we were at the edge of the village in their place of worship, which was a tree, just under a shade tree, because their building had blown over in a storm. All of a sudden, out of the bush comes 2 boys that are about 12 years old. They were the shepherds. The men, they had no interest in religion. It was all the women and the children, and then these 2 boys, 12-year-old boys. They had spent the entire night out in the wilderness with their father's animals, tending them. That was their job. They had a drum attached to their, all they had was a cloak and a little wooden, basically a little wooden pedestal that became their pillow at night or their bench during the day. And they had a drum and a staff. And they pulled out their drum and then they began to lead the singing. And I'm just thinking to myself, well, there's David. I mean, that's David, a 12-year-old, right, coming out of the wilderness. And that's where David is when Jesse goes and tries to anoint. He's the youngest. Why does this seem contrary to the way that God would operate? Wouldn't God want to look for the biggest and the strongest? People would. God says, I don't work that way. Why does God work the opposite of using the youngest and the least, the smallest of towns, Bethlehem, the littlest of the people, David? Why does God work that way?
Because it's not a king like we think of a king.
Okay. Yeah. Why
Well,
do it that way?
I think because most of the people are don't have a lot of money.
Okay. So they can relate.
There's
Okay.
a lot of rich people, but there's a lot more poor people. Not poor, but not talking about our country, but all over.
Oh, and there they were poor.
That's what God's after.
Okay. Why? Well, God's after. Well, why use them and not the strong and the mighty and the proud? Why use the weak, the lowly,
To
the
show
small?
us that, it doesn't take that brute strength, the physical, outward looking
Yeah.
thing to do this. It takes the lowliest of people.
And so if you use the least, who's actually doing all the work?
You can't earn it or buy it.
Yeah, God's going to use the least because He's the main actor. Those who are haughty, proud, and tall and strong, they think it's them. And they'll take the credit, and they'll do this, and they'll do that. And God says, but I'll do. And I'll show you how I'll do. I'll use the least of them to do the greatest. That's just the way God is operating. And it's so evident in the birthplace of Jesus, in David being the youngest, the least, the most unlikely of the characters, and it's all centered in this little village of Bethlehem. And Micah prophetically sees it, right? 750 years before it happens. Well, let's take one more look at the story of Bethlehem. Go to Matthew chapter 2. We already indicated that when Luke makes his evaluation of the city of David, he, like Jesus, rejects it as being Jerusalem. Luke says the city of David is Bethlehem. He counters everything the Old Testament has said. At least one version of the Old Testament. Matthew chapter 2. We know this as the Epiphany story. After Jesus was born in, because he was the house of David, where they went for the census, in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, and they asked, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Well, when King Herod heard of this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. So why would these wise men, why would they head to Jerusalem when they hear about the birth of a king from the stars?
Because that's the place, that's the larger.
That's the city. That's the capital. That's where the city of David is.
That's the
In their
capital
mindset, that's where you go, to the palace, where the King David's
place.
palace
Not the
was.
littlest town of
Right,
Bethlehem.
right. They have no clue. So Herod doesn't either. He called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said, well, in Bethlehem in Judea, for this was written in the prophet. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. Out of you will come a ruler who will be shepherd of my people. So they don't even know, except for a few, that this would be the place. Because who goes to Bethlehem? Nobody. What do they do in Bethlehem? They raise sheep. They probably raise sheep for what purpose?
For the wool,
Nope,
Sacrifice.
for food,
for the sacrifice. Because what happens in Jerusalem every day? Animal sacrifice. What happens Passover? 10,000 lambs get sacrificed on Passover. So there's a lot of lambs getting produced, right? And so that happens in the villages around Jerusalem. It's about 6 miles, about a 6-mile path from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. At the time of Jesus' birth, archaeologists suspect it was about a village of 200 people. That makes Fremont a metropolis. Right? That makes Bethlehem West Bloomfield.
Or Zittle.
Yeah, or Seattle, yeah. So, out of Bethlehem, right, God will always use the least and the smallest to do his greatest. In people and places, he still works that way. All right, any questions on the Matthew 5 passage? And a little bit of seeing through that, what's happening now.
I was wondering, I know from the piece that when you were kids, you see, oh, Bethlehem, was it Ephrathah? What is that, Ephrathah?
Ephrathah?
Ephrathah.
That's a good question, John. It's just another name, I think.
That it's important to Christ, to God, I mean.
I think it's just another name for the area, for the village.
Oh,
Let me quick find it here.
It's in Micah 5:2.
Yeah.
But
It's
you
in
Bethlehem,
Micah, okay.
Ephrathah,
oh, yeah, that's right.
for you are small among the clans.
And I
of Judah.
believe it's the region in which Bethlehem was located. So Ephrathah is, Bethlehem's the village. The area that around Bethlehem would have been called Ephrathah. And I believe it was the burial place of Rachel. Who Rachel was, who Jacob's second wife, right? And she was the mother of Benjamin and Joseph. And she died in childbirth with Benjamin. And Jacob had her buried in that area, in Ephrathah. And, well, it's a good thing. We're not done yet with Matthew. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 2 then. And this is actually coming off of a little bit from Jeremiah and his prophecy too. So in Matthew chapter 2, the wise men, of course, they go to Bethlehem and the star stops and they find Jesus in the house and they worship him with their gifts, right? And then they leave and do they return to Herod? No, they go another way because the angel warned them not to go back to Herod because Herod was trying to do something. Chapter 2, verse 13. Are y'all there? Now, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. So they stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, he took the child and his mother during the night, and they left for Egypt. So they're refugees now, right? Where he stayed until the death of Herod. So was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, this is through Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son. Then, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. He gave orders to kill the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, Ephrathah, right? And so the village itself, and then the vicinity which have been Ephrathah, who are 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time they had learned from the Magi. Again, archaeologists speculate this maybe would have been 5 to 10 babies. Population-wise, and then half of them being boys, they're estimating anywhere from 5 to 10. So it's not a massive massacre, but still it's gruesome. But for Herod, who killed off his sons like they were pigs, right? Not so big of a deal. Then, what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was filled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel. Where was Rachel buried? In Ephrathah, in that area, weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Okay. So it kind of all wraps up geographically in that area in the biblical passages. So is there a cost at Christmas that you're already seeing? It's kind of a foreshadowing, right? The sacrifice of these innocents. By the way, that's celebrated, do you know which day of December that's celebrated on? December 28th would be the December 26th is the Feast of Stephen. On the Feast of Stephen, right? Good King Wenceslas went out on the Feast of Stephen. That would have been December 26th. The church, Stephen was the first martyr, the first one who died for the faith. December 27th is St. John's Day. Don't know why. December 28th, don't know why, but it has always been dedicated as the slaughter of the innocents. A remembrance of those 2-year-olds who died in the place of Jesus. Because that's a foreshadowing of what? The crucifixion, where Jesus, the cost of Christmas, Jesus would die really for all of us who are not innocent, but yet will die for us. All right. So thank you, John, for bringing up Ephrathah and what that is. Yeah, that kind of all ties together. All right, anybody else on Matthew 5 or this little study of Bethlehem and what's going on? All right, one last thing to look at there. The final hope. We're going to look at that corner right there. Matthew or Micah chapter 7. So remember, Micah doesn't have a chronology necessarily, but he does follow a little bit of this pattern where he announces fierce judgment and then he counters it with grace, right? Judgment, chapters 1 and 2, end of chapter 2. A little bit of grace. He's going to shepherd us. The remnant of his people are going to get a shepherd. Chapters 3 and 4, the destruction, or chapter 3 mainly, the destruction finally of Jerusalem because of the sin of the people. But God's going to leave a remnant, right? And he's going to restore Jerusalem, give a new ruler, a new Messiah, a new king who will shepherd his people forever. Then chapter 6.
And they're going to be evil again.
Yeah, we're going to get back. Well, still, they're not again. They just kept continuously back. Yeah. And he's going to announce this courtroom scene that we talked about today in worship and about God's judgment coming upon them. And so let's just take a look at chapter 7. No, I'm going to actually look at the last verse of chapter 6. I'm going to skip up to verse 9, right when he ends the courtroom scene. So Micah chapter 6, verse 9. Listen, the Lord is calling to the city, and to fear your name is wisdom. Heed the rod and the one who appointed it. What does the rod usually do? Beat. Yeah, it's a symbol of judgment, isn't it? Am I still to forget, O wicked house, your ill-gotten treasure, and the short ephah, which is accursed? Shall I acquit a man with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights?
That's what the picture is.
Yeah, this is all about, sketchy economic practices that let people get richer and at the sake of the poor. Her rich are violent, her people are liars, their tongues speak deceitfully. Therefore, I have begun to destroy you, to ruin you because of your sins. Does that sound like fierce judgment? Yeah, it's fierce judgment. You will eat but not be satisfied. Your stomach will be still be empty. You will store up but save nothing. Because of what you save, I will give you to the sword. You will plant but not harvest. You will press olives but not use the oil on yourselves. You will crush grapes but not drink the wine. You're going to work really hard, but you're never going to see anything come out of it, right? Why? Because other nations are coming to destroy what you've accumulated. And once they destroy what you've accumulated, what do you have left? Nothing. You spend your whole life chasing it, and now you got nothing. All right, so skip over to chapter 7 now. And I'm gonna go down to verse 5. Chapter 7, verse 5. And he says, do not trust a neighbor. Right? Put no confidence in a friend. Even with her who lies in your embrace, be careful of your words. Your own wife, right? For a son dishonors his father, a daughter rises up against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the members of his own household. You want to talk about misery? Watch your life, your whole familial life be torn apart, your whole relationships gone, torn apart. But as for me, I watch and hope for the Lord. I wait for God, my Savior, for my God will hear me. So the final verdict that he brings down is in judgment that because of the wrath that's coming and all the hardship that comes from it, all your relationships are dissolved. You're utterly alone. You are totally and utterly alone. That's the element of God's judgment. But he says, I'm going to watch and hope. And here's what he's going to envision. We're going to take a look at verses 18 through 20 specifically. But before we do that, we're going to do one more Bible gymnastics. We're going to go back to Exodus chapter 34. Keep your page in Micah 7, and then skip back to Exodus 34. Really getting the workout today. Exodus chapter 34, and this is after the golden calf episode, right? So God brings the people out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, right? He saves and delivers his people. They pass through the Red Sea, where again God says, I'll fight for you. What do you need to do? Nothing. Be still. Let your hands lay at your side, be still, I'll fight for you today. These Pharaoh and his armies, they get wiped out in the Red Sea, right? God fights for them. He brings them to the mountain. He makes that covenant with them. We looked at that again last week, that 7th part. I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt. Here are the stipulations. Preserve yourself and commit yourself to it. I've got witnesses. And then finally, if you do it, blessings. If you don't, you're cursed. Right? And they wander in the wilderness, and they've already, when God asked Moses to come up to the mountain to deliver the tablets to them, what do the people tell Aaron to do? Build us a god. Yeah, and they build the golden calf. It's an image of what he saw in Egypt. And so he takes their gold and he makes the calf, and they start worshiping that. And God looks at that, and his anger is burning. Moses takes the tablets and crushes them, right? And then he's got to go back up. And now he's going back up to God. And God says, I want to wipe the people out. Moses says, no, you're not that kind of a God. I'll go in their place. Wipe me out. And God says, no, you're right. I'm a covenant God. And so this is God defining himself. This is God defining himself in chapter 34. So the Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me on the top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or to be seen anywhere in the mountain. Not even the flocks and herds may graze in the front of the mountain. So Moses chiseled out of the stone 2 tablets like the first ones. He went up on Mount Sinai early in the morning as Yahweh, right, Lord, all capitalized, that's his name, as Yahweh had commanded him. He carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then Yahweh came down in the cloud, right? He descends and stood there with them and proclaimed his name. If you're standing, what are you going to probably have? Feet. God's descending in a cloud and standing. It seems to be an appearance of God in human form, if you will. And he proclaimed his name, Yahweh. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, Yahweh, Yahweh. This is the only time in the Old Testament, the only time where there's a dual phrase, Yahweh, Yahweh. I am, I am, I am, I am. He's saying his own name. This is a creedal confession. This is like an Apostles' Creed of the Old Testament. God defining himself. Yahweh, Yahweh. And now notice the adjectives that he describes himself with. The compassionate and gracious God. Slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. And yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished, right? Punishes those. But his chief characteristic, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love, a steadfast love, that should actually be the chesed word, maintaining steadfast love to thousands, forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Those are pretty great descriptions of God, aren't they? And where do they come from? Who's the source? Himself. God defining himself. Okay. Now, keep that in mind. Now let's go to Micah chapter 7. Right? I'm glad you kept it. I put my fork in there. So. All right, so Micah. The name. Remember what we said the name Micah means? Micah. In Hebrew, it's Micah. It means one who is like Yahweh. One who is like Yahweh. That's what his name means, Micah. One who is like Yahweh. Okay, now go to verse 18. Somebody want to read just the first line of verse 18, the first 5 words.
Who is a God like you?
There you go. There's a question, right? Who is a God like you? What has Micah done with that first line of verse 18? in his final hope that he's going to give people. He's done a word play on what? His own name. His name means one who is like Yahweh. And so his final word to the people is going to be, who is a God like you? He's doing a word play. Now, what's the answer? Nobody. There is no God like you. You're incomparable. There is no God like you. Why? Well, let's hear what Micah has to say. Somebody want to read the rest of verse 17 and 18, please. I'm not 17. I meant 18. Just the rest of verse 18. That's what I meant. My bad.
Who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of the inheritance. You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy.
Who pardons iniquity, passes over transgressions, or forgives them. What did God define himself? What was God's great joy? How did he define himself? He is the God who does what? Loves and forgives and pardons people's sin, rebellion, and wickedness. So our friend Micah is simply saying, this is our final hope. Even though we wander away, even though we are proud and haughty and full of ourselves so often, God's going to always be the God who pardons and passes over our transgressions. He's not going to retain his anger forever, right? He's slow to anger. That's how God defines himself. All Micah is reminding us back of that. This is who God is. There is no other hope. Everything else without that is hopeless. And when you have that, that's the hope. Because he delights in, now you said mercy, I think, right? But that steadfast love, he delights in chesed, his characteristic of steadfast love. His unfailing mercy, which means how much of it depends upon you? Nothing. Your good looks? Nope. Your smarts? Nope. Your faithfulness? Nope. Your devoted service? Nope. None of it. Your being able to sing on key? Nope. None of it. None of it. And then, let's read verse 19. Someone want to read verse 19, please.
You will again have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea.
You will, again, that's a huge word. What does that mean?
Repeatedly, always.
Repeatedly, always. Which means we'll repeatedly what?
Sin.
Sin, fail, fall short. And again, what will we do?
Over and over and over again.
Over and over again, have compassion. Forgiving, being steadfast, being faithful, again and again and again. And then he will tread our iniquities underfoot, casting our sins into the depths of the sea. What does that image give you? Casting sins into the depths of the sea.
It'll be out of sight, out of mind.
Out of sight, out of mind. Good. What else? What salvation event in the Old Testament?
Oh, the Red Sea, parting of the Red Sea.
Yeah. What gets tread underfoot and cast into the depths of the sea there?
Our enemies.
The enemies. Yeah. He's going to cast them into the sea. He's going to do Exodus stuff again. Because you were so faithful? No. No. Just the opposite. Even when we're unfaithful. He'll always be faithful. And that's a lot, verse 20, right? Then you will show faithfulness to Jacob. Who's Jacob? Father of Israel. The people. And steadfast love to Abraham. These great covenants that God has made, he's never going to relinquish. You will be my people. I will be your God. To Jacob, to Abraham, right? You will be a blessing for all the families of the earth. They'll come under my rule again through you. And I'm going to be steadfast to that. Nothing will hinder me from that. He'll always keep searching for people and calling them back to himself. Because he is faithful, not the people. And that's where Micah ends with this final hope. Well, who is a God like you? No one. And he's our God. And we're his. And that's why we have hope. And that's next week's message. Hope. So what are some hopeless things that we say are hopeless? Me singing on key. All right, that's one.
Illness.
Illness. Yeah, when we get sick. Feels hopeless, doesn't it? Right.
Relationships.
Relationships breaking apart. Seems hopeless. What's hope, Matt? How would you define hope?
Being able to find the good in
How does the world use hope? I hope I win.
Lottery.
I hope I win the lottery, right? And so, what does that really mean? Hope. What do we really mean by that? Wish, right? I wish I win it. Hope is not the same as a wish. A wish, people graphically said, you hope in this hand, and you crap in this hand, and you put them two together. What do you have? 2 hands of crap now, right? A wish, and that's not what hope is. Biblical hope is not that. It's not a wish. Hope is an expectation. The expectation that this will happen. So you all know the story of Nelson Mandela, the political activist in South Africa trying to end apartheid, was imprisoned by the South African government unjustly, right? In prison. I can't remember how long. It was a long sentence. While he was imprisoned, his granddaughter was born, and his daughter was able to visit. They allowed the visit that he could meet his granddaughter because in his tribal tradition, the grandfather had the privilege of naming the children. And he named her in his ethnic language, gave her the name Hope, because he still had hope in the midst of the darkness, had an expectation that God would somehow do something. And it wasn't 15, I think it was 15 years later, finally, that he was released. But yet that hope sustained him, right? That just the naming of that child in a hopeless situation, imprisoned in physical labor. It wasn't like he was sitting in a jail cell. He was doing manual labor in boot camp, work camps. Brutal stuff. But yet he saw a time, an expectation that God would somehow do something. And right, it was freed. South Africa was freed from apartheid. You remember the bishop's name? Desmond Tutu. He led the reconciliation. Mandela had enough wisdom that he knew that if they did not allow forgiveness and reconciliation to rule, what would happen?
Civil war.
There would be a civil war, right? And there would be retribution against those who had been the oppressors. And so Desmond Tutu led the reconciliation. So they would have courtrooms, and they would have guards who were brutal men who, brutalized people, killing innocents sometimes, or mob and stuff. And the one scene that I remember seeing was this mother who had one of her sons basically burned to death by prison guards. She came and she offered that prison guard her forgiveness in an act of reconciliation. He still had the consequences, right? He still had the jail time in it with that. But she was able to see past it and offer forgiveness, which is pretty mind-blowing, right? Pretty mind-blowing. Those acts of reconciliation. Doesn't mean she was okay with it, right? But she was able to offer that forgiveness. And that was the hope that Nelson Mandela kind of saw, this expectation that God would set things right in his lifetime or the next, but he knew that God would set that right. That's kind of where Micah ends the story. That this is the God of hope. Even though it looks like our days are numbered, and they were, the judgment came, there still was a remnant, and there was still God's faithful promise. He would still set things right, because he is a God who always is compassionate again and again and again. All right, that's kind of where it ends with the story of Micah, the book of Micah. Anybody got any questions or thoughts of these 7 chapters of this prophet?
Was Nelson Mandela, was he a Christian? They were like slaves, weren't
There was
they? The
apartheid.
black people were.
It was apartheid. There was this
Down.
different. Excuse me. They weren't slaves, but the Dutch government. The Dutch it was a government of the Dutch people. They were white rule, and it was apartheid. And so apartheid is one people group oppressing another people group, economically, politically.
Right.
And the people wanted to gain freedom, right? And Nelson Mandela didn't want. He was a Martin Luther King advocate of no violence and stuff like that. Let's do this, but let's do it the right way. And it took finally world governments banning, we boycotted South Africa and all that kind of stuff, and it took a world movement to end that apartheid. But it is kind of what's happening in the West Banks of Israel today. I mean, it's an apartheid system where the Israelis rule over the Palestinians in their controlled land, and it's the same thing. Now, the reaction of violence is wrong. It's not the way that God would have it done, but the apartheid is wrong as well. Yeah. All right, but good question. Thanks. Anybody else? Any other thoughts or wonderments on the prophet Micah? So we call him one of the minor prophets, but we've realized there's